and welcome to the Rainbow Umbrella, the podcast where we talk about anything and everything under the rainbow. Joining me again today is Dr. Rebecca Stringer, Senior Lecturer in Gender Studies at the University of Otago. Our mutual interest in true crime came up in a previous conversation, so I knew I had to ask Rebecca back. Welcome, it's so nice to have you here and to have an opportunity to kōrero with you again.
It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me back.
So exciting. This one is wild. So for this episode, we're going to discuss the case of Bobby Franks, which in 2 days has its 100-year anniversary, and at the time was known as the crime of the century. This case has so many layers to it, and there's so much to dive into. You're really familiar with this case, Rebecca. Can you start by giving us an overview of Bobby's murder?
Indeed, I can. So to understand this, we return to Chicago in the 1920s. Mm-hmm. It's the Jazz Age. It's just after the First World War. You know, that's still in, strong living memory. And the crime kind of hit the newspapers real quick, and it dominated the front page of the Chicago dailies for 4 months, right?
Whoa.
So, and of course it's had, intermittent newspaper and other media coverage thereafter. So it was a big event. It began with them finding Bobby's body, where, the culprits had left the body. One of the two culprits had left their glasses at the scene, and it was a rare prescription glass, set of glasses. So that's one of the ways in which the culprits were found. But basically they had designed this crime. So the perpetrators in this case are Leopold and Loeb, right? Nathan Leopold, and Dickie Loeb is how they'd refer to him. And Nathan's nickname was Babe. And they were two young men, so they're 18 and 19, both immensely intelligent, both already enrolled in university. They were doing law. And they used their legal smarts to design a crime that would enable them to kind of outsmart the police. Mm-hmm. And so they'd done a number of kind of property crimes together almost as practice. And then they decided that they were going to actually kill somebody. It's unclear. It's interesting because we still don't know which of the two actually killed Bobby, right? So that's a lasting ambiguity about this case. They were caught together, they were tried together, they were sentenced together, and then they ended up in prison together with that secret intact. So the two culprits in this case were basically young, bohemian. They refer to them as Chicago scions. I think that's how you say the word, scion or skion. It means somebody who's very, very wealthy and who stands to, inherit a fortune. So they both had, really wealthy families, and they had, it seems they were in love with one another, or at the least these two had formed a kind of contract together. And broadly the understanding is that Nathan Leopold was quite in love with Loeb and was kind of like, well, if you'll love me back, I'll do crime with you. So it seemed to be that kind of arrangement. And so they were looking for somebody to kidnap. This was 21st of May, 1924. They're in their own neighbourhood. They're searching for a boy. The wider context was it was actually Chicago Boys Week, and so there was a kind of irony that they had in mind there. They'd tried to kind of catch a few boys and had failed. And then there's Bobby Franks walking home from school. And Bobby was actually Loeb's second cousin, so they did know who he was, and he knew who they were. And they were like, hey, you want to ride home? And he's like, absolutely not. And then Loeb tempted him with a new tennis racket, saying, but I've got this amazing tennis racket that you're going to want to see. So Bobby Franks was a keen tennis player. And so that's how he came to be in the car. The ambiguity now, Mel, is who was driving and who actually killed Bobby in the car. It's unclear. One of them drove, the other killed Bobby. Then they went off to this outlying area in Chicago called Wolf's Creek, and they disposed of the body in a culvert. And the body was found naked. They used acid to disfigure the body. Then they had prepared a ransom note. So they had prepared a kind of ransom spiel and a note. And so they actually called the Franks home and said, we have your son, we've kidnapped him, we want you to give us, this quantity of money. And they actually missed the pickup of the money. The Franks did organise to pay the ransom, but they missed the pickup. And in the meantime, the body is found. And so broadly that's what happened sort of around the crime. Then, of course, came the police investigation and, it was a long and reasonably torturous investigation where, Loeb tried to frame a teacher at the school, so a teacher who was kind of identified as a gay man. Loeb also attended a lot of the police meetings and was kind of around observing the investigation. So he obviously kind of wanted to see the police investigating a crime that he had committed and that they didn't know he'd committed,
It's that classic inserting yourself into the investigation, right?
Yeah. And, they fully investigated that teacher and it looked for a while there like he might lose his job, but he didn't. And then they found the glasses, they matched the glasses to Leopold. They then called Leopold and Loeb in for questioning. And then what really did them in was the servant of the Leopold house coming along and saying, these young men, they couldn't possibly have done such a thing. Why? That day they had especially hired a car. And that night, there I was cleaning the car for them. Then the police were like, they hired a car, eh? And so it was interesting. The well-meaning servant is actually the person who gave them away to police. So there in broad outline is a kind of sense of what happened here. And maybe you can guess already the kinds of things that led to it being such a high-profile case.
Well, that leads nicely into my next question. So why was it considered the crime of the century? Why was it so fascinating to people?
Yeah, right. So there's so much going on in this case. And one could say that is very, very layered, that term, layered. So it had to do really, well, cultural historians differ on this. So Paula Fass says it's because they were so young. So there was a horror at the notion of children killing children, right? So at 18 and 19, they were seen as, minors. And they had killed 14-year-old Bobby Franks. So there was a sense of kind of social apocalypse that came with this idea. Mind you, just, in the First World War, there were lots of young men called upon to precisely do this. So I do think that the post-war imaginary was reacting here. It's also the case that with these kinds of crimes, there was an expectation that people of lower social class had done this crime. So when it was found, it was people who were very wealthy and who want for nothing and who wouldn't have really needed the ransom if they'd got it. That was another point of horror for people, that these are high-profile young men who have all of the world's riches and opportunities, so why would they do such a thing? But mainly, and here's David Churchill's argument, and I tend to agree with him. I think Paula Fass has done fascinating work in this area, but Churchill's argument, he points out that the police investigation led by Prosecutor Crowe, who was, no shrinking violet, let's say, Prosecutor Crowe, he referred to Leopold and Loeb throughout as perverts. Even before they came to light as culprits, because Bobby Franks had been found naked, there was already a kind of homophobic response unfolding here. And, you know, they use the P word thick and fast. You see it in the documents from the time. You know, this is a pervert, you know, something that perverts have done. Reference to sexual perversion. So Churchill says, yeah, there were all these factors at play, them being rich, bohemian, young, Jewish. So all three involved here, Bobby Franks and his murderers, they're all Jewish, young Jewish men. So that, you know, sure, there were all of those factors, but Churchill says the key factor and the reason why we still know about this case, why it wasn't forgotten, is because of their concupiscent attachment, the fact that it seemed as though Leopold and Loeb might have been in love.
And we'll pull on that thread a little bit later, but first I want to talk about the newspapers. So they played a significant part in not only the reporting on the crime, but in fueling the extreme interest and popularity of the case. So can you talk us through the impact that the reporting on Bobby's death had on the investigation and trial?
Oh, yes. And, of course, this is where Paul Laface's archival research is amazing. So people got involved in every kind of way. So the newspapers fed and kept feeding attention to the case. They were saying, write to us with your opinions. They were sponsoring people to write sort of short fictional stories based on the case. They were really engaging the public, saying your views of this matter. Come to our newspaper to express your disgust and horror, basically. And so it meant that, and, you know, Leopold later in the 50s when he writes his autobiography called Life Plus 99 Years, that's the sentence they received, he unpacks this quite a lot. And he talks about various things that he said to newspaper reporters at the time, because they were in the police station, they were around the court. So Leopold and Loeb were very accessible to them. He talks about, you know, I said this and this is what I meant, but then this is where they went with it. And it was always in the direction of making them out to be like more monstrous and even more callous than they actually were. In the autobiography, Leopold says, you know, how can I express what a monster I was? So it is quite a regret-filled autobiography. But of course, William Randolph Hearst was commandeering the Chicago, I think it's the Chicago Times at this time, and he was very invested in the controversy. And when the trial came underway, he was like, right, I want none other than Sigmund Freud to come to Chicago and, you know, tell us about the sick mindset of these youth, you know. And so Sigmund Freud refused, said, unfortunately, I'm unwell and cannot attend, and didn't give a legal opinion. So that gives you a sense of how much they were wanting to kind of sustain this story. Yeah.
That's a beautiful segue into my next question, you know, the use of psychology for both the prosecution and the defence. It's new and very interesting here. And particularly the fact that the defence wasn't going for a plea of insanity, you know, because the boys confessed to doing it, but they wanted to argue that the boys were obviously unwell. Not insane, but unwell, or disturbed, I think is the word that was used. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right, Mel. So it was very interesting what unfolded around that. In fact, what we see here is a very early use of Freudian psychoanalysis. So Freud didn't attend, but Clarence Darrow, who was appointed to defend Leopold and Loeb, he was already something of a celebrity in the States, a celebrity defence attorney. And he was an opponent of the death penalty. So because they'd confessed, but blamed each other for the crime, you know, so they were like, they confessed, but they blamed each other, so it is still unclear who did it, or which of the two of them was the primary. Because they'd confessed, the legal situation was either at sentencing, they get a death penalty, or they could have not pled guilty. They could have gone for the insanity plea. And, of course, Crowe expected that they were going to plead insanity. He was like, "Ha, you're going to do that, aren't you?" And he got a bunch of psychologists to say these people are perfectly sane, and this was a premeditated murder, and therefore the death penalty is going to be in place here. But Darrow ingeniously short-circuited all of that by bringing in the person who in the States was introducing Freudian psychoanalysis kind of into the paradigm in the 1920s. That's pretty early because the heyday of psychoanalysis doesn't really happen until the 50s. So it's early days in bringing psychoanalytic thinking into public processes here. Darrow hires him and several other people who were all about construing Leopold and Loeb not as insane but as having psychic abnormality due to difficult childhoods, so absent parents. Darrow also really emphasised Nietzsche's philosophy, so Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, as a source of kind of poisonous pedagogy here. Leopold in particular had read his Nietzsche and was really sort of working with those ideas. And it seems that Nietzsche did provide something of an inspiration for them, the idea of being outside of common morality, and common morality is this constraint that one should step outside of. So Darrow said that, what chance did these boys have with these kinds of influences, the poisonous pedagogy of Nietzsche, the neglect of them as youth? All of these things can be blamed upon a kind of abnormal psychology produced in abnormal childhoods. And so they're not saying they're insane, they're saying instead there are mitigating circumstances here. And all of this means he actually said to the Judge Cavalier in the trial, so if you sentence them to death, you have the murder of 2 children on your hands. You will be responsible for murdering these 2 boys. So that gives you a sense of where things went legally. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, the Nietzschean thing is really interesting because throughout the trial and throughout the whole proceedings, the boys were kind of portrayed in 3 very distinct ways that you've touched upon, precocious Nietzschean supermen, overindulged, spoiled thrill killers, or, troubled youths. So which of these 3 things do you think was the most impactful?
Oh, I think the psychology probably really cut it in court. The idea, and you've got to remember too, like in the old days of, pre-digital days, obviously, there were literally screeds of psychological reporting on these 2. So Hal Higdon, who kind of wrote the book about the case, I think it's just called The Crime of the Century, he talks about there being more psychological reporting on these 2 culprits in this case than in any case, virtually in any case before or since, is what he suggests, when he was writing that book initially in the 90s. So there was this kind of authorising of psychoanalysis as this new perspective that was a cutting-edge modern perspective that's making a new kind of legal defence available here and enabling us to know more about the human psyche. So in the context of the court, I think that was quite decisive. But in terms of, but also Darrow's rhetoric around the death penalty was really powerful. So in those days, people who were against the death penalty were for life sentences. And so he was really situating life sentences as the kind of Christian response to murder. That what one does is one sympathises with the wrongdoer and believes in their capacity for rehabilitation. So that Christian perspective these days kind of lives on to some extent as the liberal perspective. But so I don't know, it's hard to isolate which factor, but there were quite a few at play in this case.
Layered again, very layered. So do you think the outcome or even perceptions of the case and of Leopold and Loeb themselves would be different if the newspaper reporting and the use of psychology as part of the defence weren't as significant or prominent?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot got put in the way of a death penalty for these two. And so, yeah, I think they made all the difference. And, you know, it meant that, I mean, it's funny because Truman Capote, he was born the year this crime occurred. And then he goes on later in life to write In Cold Blood, inspired in part by all of the creative kind of books that came out of this case. And one of the things in Cold Blood, he's concerned with a pair of culprits. Again, it's the pair, the criminal pair, who commit crime together. And, you know, at the end he kind of says, you know, the rich never hang. Because the pair that he's talking about in his work, you know, they were put to death. And so there is a question there with the Leopold and Loeb case of, would these wealthy young men actually have faced the death penalty? Would that have really happened? And there are, you know, some have argued no, but I do still think that the extraordinary defence and these new concepts brought in by psychoanalysis made a huge difference. And there's also Clarence Darrow's, you know, 12-hour closing address. I wonder if that's still permitted in law. 12 hours. And, you know, it was hot. You know, they in the recreations, the best are in the film by Tom Kalin called Swoon. You know, everybody's sitting there with a fan, you know, trying to get through the Chicago heat and listen to this man for 12 hours.
I mean, the $1 million defence, they got what they were paying for, right?
They got what they were paying for, but the hilarious thing, Mel, is that they never paid him. So Clarence Darrow went ultimately without payment. He got to live on some ranch for a while. Like he got to live on one of their salubrious ranches for a bit, but he didn't actually get paid. Imagine that.
Imagine it. Imagine it. So as you've said, ultimately the boys were jailed for the murders and sent to the same prison. But it wasn't until some years later that their sexuality became to be discussed in more detail, and it was deliberately kept out of all reporting and discussion of the murder and the trial, though innuendo was definitely made. So how did this affect the perceptions of the case and the boys, now men, involved?
Oh, well, you know, they were referred to as perverts throughout the trial. That was the word of choice in those days. And even Darrow used that term. But yes, later on, I mean, it only took 5 years for this story to make it onto the stage. So then we have Patrick Hamilton writing the stage play Rope about this. And he's called it Rope because in his sort of fictional retelling of the crime, they use rope rather than what actually happened in the real crime. And rope, of course, is also what you're killed with on the scaffold. So Patrick Hamilton expressed, because there was sort of horror that these two weren't killed, right? There was a public, you know, in the newspapers and in sort of public responses, there was these two have gotten away with murder, you know. The idea that a life sentence, they got life plus 99 years, that somehow they were getting away with it, right? So I think the stage play by Patrick Hamilton, later made into a film by Alfred Hitchcock, the film Rope, these really played on public, you know, anger about the result. And so I'd challenge you to find more homophobic texts. Really, there is this kind of quite disgusting depiction of Leopold and Loeb in the stage play and, you know, in Hitchcock's film as well, that is really, really quite disturbing. And, of course, it affects how Bobby Franks is depicted as well. So weirdly, in these situations, people think they're sticking up for the victim by depicting the perpetrators in such a horrific light. but actually it results in these really sad depictions of Bobby Franks that further detract from him, do you know what I mean, further take away from him. I'm not sure I've answered your question. I might have rambled a little bit there. But yeah, homophobia was the key theme really from then on.
Yeah. And so this obviously would have impacted their lives in prison, right?
Absolutely. Yes, indeed. They had an interesting time in prison. So initially they weren't put together, and then they were put together, and then together they created they extended university into prison. So Leopold was particularly impatient to get back to academic work, and so they created this kind of school and enabled the prisoners around them to do university qualifications. They kind of built that together and they ran it together. And Leopold, who, genius IQ, and he spoke, I think, 15 languages. He ended up training and he became a sociologist and then a criminologist. And he actually published peer-review criminological research from prison.
That's so wild.
Yeah. And his area of specialisation was parole prediction. So that was very interesting.
Yeah, wow.
And he writes all about this in his autobiography, Life Plus 99 Years. He talks about, his missing contact with trees and birds. So he was an ornithologist, is that what you call him?
Ornithologist, yeah.
Ornithologist, thank you.
Yeah.
A twitcher, otherwise known as a twitcher. And that's how he knew to take the body to Wolf Lake. But he missed that contact, and so he talks about a bird he nurtured when he was inside and things like that. But yeah, so they had quite the life inside the prison. But then there was homophobia as well, right? Yeah.
Yeah, because in a shocking, dramatic twist, Loeb himself was murdered in prison by another prisoner accusing him of, coming on to him, sort of thing. So do you feel that this may have been more of a commentary on homophobia or an indication of the lack of safety in prisons, or a combination of the two?
Definitely a combination of the two, because Day, who murdered Loeb, he got quite a light sentence. And there was a juror who spoke out at the time, who, not in a contesting way, they were actually saying, we just thought it was actually good that this guy got murdered, that he has been disposed of. And he was referring to him being a gay man. Wow. That it's good to dispose of somebody who is gay. So that was a juror on the case. So Tom Kalin, who wrote the new queer cinema classic that tells the story of the Leopold and Loeb Frank's murder differently, it's an art house cinema, and it's a kind of real reclaiming of their story. And it came out in the 90s, early 90s, brilliant film. Where he goes with it is he actually Swoon starts with the murder of Bobby Franks by Leopold and Loeb, and then it ends with the murder of Loeb by Day. And he's actually contrasting the two murders.
Right.
He's saying, look what happens when, these two kill this young boy. This is terrible. Look at the amount of attention and public disapproval as expressed here. Now let's look at what happened to Loeb. And look at how a juror came out publicly and said, oh, yes, we homophobes think that this should happen. Right? So he's actually asking us, the film asks us to consider the difference between those two legal processes and see what homophobia can do in terms of what kinds of lives are valuable, are considered valuable at this time, and what kinds of lives are seen as disposable. And, of course, this really rides roughshod over – one of the things that I think is important to register is that Bobby Franks himself was an opponent of the death penalty. He was known in his school for a kind of speech that he gave, arguing really passionately against the death penalty. And his family, when asked, never wanted the death penalty. Jacob Franks, Bobby Franks' father, publicly stated that he would like to see Leopold and Loeb have some sort of psychological supervision. He didn't want them to go to prison. And years after, when Leopold was finally going for parole, Josephine, who was Bobby Frank's sister, she said, look, I can't support your parole bid, but I won't block it.
Interesting.
Right? So you've got to remember here too, the sensibilities of the Franks family, they were not participating in this discourse of, these so-called disposable perverts. That was not the family's view. So the homophobic films that come out and then stand corrected by Tom Kalin in Swoon, those homophobic films do a disservice to the Franks family and to Bobby Frank's memory. And that's the point I want to make around this case, is that the idea that shaming Leopold and Loeb in that vein of homophobia, the idea that that supports the victim is completely wrong. It's wrong anyway, but it's especially wrong in this case. Yeah.
I want to go back to what you said before about the idea that the boys were in love with each other, because that immediately made me think of Parker and Hume.
Right.
And I'm sure that I'm not the only one that's drawn that parallel.
Right.
So do you think that, a case that happened some 50 years later on the other side of the world, there would have been parallels there, or maybe even, legal precedent drawn back to Leopold and Loeb?
Yeah, I think so. I think you could definitely explore that. That would be worth exploring. And the other thing, that idea, I'm going off Heavenly Creatures here, mind you, thanks Peter and Fran, I'm going off Heavenly Creatures in talking about those two as having this shared psychic life of a created, they've invented a world apart. Their love isn't possible in this world, and they together invent a world apart. You can see that with Leopold and Loeb, this sense of, and Tom Kalin really captures that in Swoon. He talks about, Swoon kind of teaches us about the kind of sexual revolution happening in the 20s, particularly in the kind of the bohemian scene. And, Kalin got a whole lot of, drag kings and drag queens to play parts in Swoon in order to have us know that in the 20s there was this kind of awakening going on of queer identities. And so, and importantly, Swoon puts Leopold and Loeb as very at home in this world. They have a world. It's the bohemian social scene where they're understood, and accepted. And I guess where the law went with that, they really kind of blamed Nietzsche. Interestingly, Nietzsche already carried a certain connotation in legal contexts. So the cultural historian Sander Gilman brings this out. There was in Germany a couple of decades before Leopold and Loeb, there was the Nietzsche murder case. So somebody who claimed to have murdered because he read Nietzsche's philosophy and realised there was no real morality, that God is dead and we can do what we want. That's, cheaply, that's kind of the idea. And so there was this existing blaming of Nietzsche. And if you're into Nietzsche, it bespeaks a non-normative sexuality on your part. So there was this sort of connotation there with Nietzsche's name of non-normative sexuality. So he's another key site of blame there. This poisonous pedagogy that encourages perversion, basically, is how they were thinking of it.
Yeah, and just to be clear, non-normative is non-heteronormative, right?
Yeah, right. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So after Loeb was killed, Leopold was eventually eligible for parole, and he had to start relying on the public's opinion and goodwill to support his bid for release and for parole, something he hadn't really been into in the past, especially after the release of the novel Compulsion. So can you talk us through how he went about gaining the public's support and kind of, if not admiration, general goodwill?
Yeah. Well, interestingly, the author of Compulsion, Maya Levin, he fronted up to Leopold's parole hearing. And Maya Levin vaguely knew Leopold and Loeb, and he was kind of as part of their university scene. And he spoke on Leopold's behalf. At this point, I mean, there's a subtext here, which is the idea is that Leopold loved Loeb, but Loeb was the killer, right? That's kind of the subtext, not known as fact, didn't come out in the trial, but that's sort of the assumption. So there's often this assumption that Leopold was kind of a victim as well of Loeb, if you know what I mean. So, yeah, I think that's part of what happened there. Yeah.
And so while he was in prison, you mentioned about, the educational things he set up. He ended up becoming a tester for malaria drugs, like anti-malaria drugs, and doing all of these things, which I think is crazy, because if it was someone that hadn't killed someone or participated in a murder, it would have been like, oh, look at you go. You're doing all of these wonderful things.
Yeah.
But do you think that the fact that he did these from prison, even though he was trying to, hey, look, I'm not actually such a bad guy, do you think the fact that he did it from prison tainted that image?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure. I think all that he did kind of really stood him in good stead for getting parole eventually. He went for it several times and was denied, and then he gets it in the 50s. And I think Maya Levin, speaking on his behalf, and Bobby Frank's sister saying, I'm not going to block this, I think those things really helped. I mean, I don't know whether – I think he was redeemed in the public's eyes in the sense that eventually the thought was, well, it was probably Loeb. And the films underlined that too. The films suggested that this was a master-slave relationship in which Leopold was under the control of Loeb, a kind of puppy love gone wrong story. But, it's intriguing because we just don't know. We really don't know. And the truth, as it were, is now well buried under these narratives that are more powerful, I guess, now than yeah.
And so this case is one that's remained interesting and been kept in the public eye for many, many years after the crime itself. We've got books, we've got plays, we've got films. What is it about this case that keeps people coming back to it? What is it that keeps them so fascinated after so long?
Yeah. It's a good – well, I reckon – I mean, the first two films, we've got Hitchcock's Rope, based on Hamilton's play, and then Compulsion, right? And let's just state clearly, Rope is an intensely homophobic film. It's really disturbing, actually. Then we move on to Compulsion. Maya Levin kind of writes the novel Compulsion in reaction to Rope. He's like, hang on, you've told this story wrong, I'm going to set the record straight. And then Fleischer goes ahead and makes it into a film. But it was also homophobic. It was trying to put Leopold and Loeb in a more positive light. But through the vein of, homosexual desire is a mere phase. And thank goodness they got life, because that enabled them to live on beyond this phase. So there was just sort of a different form of homophobia operating there. And then when everybody really goes back to the story is in the 80s and 90s, when there's new queer cinema is happening. It's post-Stonewall. There are gay and lesbian liberation, movements everywhere. And then we have this move to kind of tell the story differently and to out the homophobia of the narrative. And that's what Swoon does so brilliantly. And it, does become a kind of an instant classic of new queer cinema. And then we have all these other productions as well. We've got off-Broadway and off-Broadway productions retelling the story of Leopold and Loeb in a way that critiques the homophobia present in early stories. Then, unfortunately, we have Murder by Numbers, which came out in 2002 and is the most recent Leopold and Loeb film, which just restores the homophobia of earlier films. Mm-hmm. That's the Sandra Bullock, Ryan Gosling, Michael Pitt one.
Right.
So, unfortunately, we had a return of the homophobia in the new century telling, which I found very odd. Bit of a backlash text, the old Murder by Numbers.
Okay, I won't add that one to the list.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me here today and talking about this case that's wild. Look it up if you want more details. It's fascinating. I loved reading about it.
There's a lot of revisiting going on around the centenary of the case.
Yeah.
So it is time. It is a good moment to kind of have a think. I saw that there was a new film in production called something like American Criminals.
Okay.
So it's possible that there'll be another film. But yeah, I think a key point to underline in conclusion is that, they were happy to blame Nietzsche, but they were actually working off their legal degrees when they designed the crime. They were law students. So, I'll just leave you with that.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rebecca.
Thank you.
The Rainbow Umbrella is kindly sponsored by the Aurora Cafe in Mosgiel. The Rainbow Umbrella theme song is by Paul S. Allen and Beth. Check them out on Spotify. New episodes of The Rainbow Umbrella are available every fourth Thursday on Otago Access Radio 105.4 FM, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you like to get your podcasts. Do you have an idea for an episode or something you would like to kōrero about? Get in touch at rainbowumbrellapod@gmail.com.
Aurora Cafe in Mosgiel is your family-friendly cafe and caterers with traditional, unpretentious food cooked and presented the good old-fashioned way. Our extensive cabinet selection features delicious fresh home baking with sandwiches made daily and to order. Enjoy a light meal. Choose from our all-day breakfast menu or maybe a burger, guaranteed to challenge any appetite. Children's menu and a playground to entertain them while you enjoy a locally roasted coffee at the Aurora Cafe, Gordon Road, Mosgiel.